Our next session is called Daggers and Darogas, Historical Whodunits, a look at historical mysteries, murder, and power across time. Please welcome Madhulika Liddle, creator of the Muzaffar Jung Mysteries, Shampa Roy, author of Stroke of Death, in conversation with novelist Madhavi Mahadevan. Please give it up to them.
Good evening, everyone. Um, how many of you here believe that women are very good as crime writers? Please raise your hands. Okay, great. So, today we are going to be discovering for ourselves, hearing it right from the ladies. Hello, can you? Yeah. Okay, so we are going to find out today how good are women as historical crime writers. Of course, women have historical memories, they remember every single thing about everyone, so it's a natural thing for them to be, good at history and crime. But this is a sort of blended genre because both are very solid historical fiction and crime fiction. So, my question to both my panelists, who are very experienced, I think in Madhulika has written about 4, 5. How many books, Madhulika? 4 books on historical crime, and Shampa has just brought out her debut novel. So, please tell us all, how do you see historical crime fiction? What is it offering you as a writer that, say, just historical fiction or, say, the crime fiction alone does not offer? Is there something about the society of that times, injustices, everyday life, social tension? What attracted you to the idea of blending history with mystery?
Okay, with me, it's just that these are two areas which I find very interesting. I find history very interesting, and not the sort of history we feel. Like if you're studying in a school in India, or if you have studied in a school in India, you would know that school textbooks tend to be rather dry. All you ever read about is political history, and this dynasty followed this dynasty, this war, this campaign, etc. But that is not the sort of history I'm interested in. I'm interested in the history of people, of regular everyday people. How did you live? How did you sort of, what did you eat, what did you wear, what were the social norms you had to skirt around, things like that. That is what interests me. And I think detective fiction set in that period can be an interesting way of looking at what everyday life would have been like, and especially when something like a murder uh, sort of upsets the status quo, so to say. So I think, and in any case, detective fiction I find a very entertaining, in any set in any time, can be a very entertaining genre. And for me, setting it in a historical period is like having your cake and eating it too. So it's fun, it's interesting, and yet you get an idea of a period different from yours. So that, I think, for me, that is what draws me to historical fiction, historical detective fiction. Not just writing it, but actually reading it. And it's because of reading a huge amount of this sort of fiction that I actually decided to write one. So we will come to that later.
Uh, yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. So I think pretty much similar to what Madhulika just said. I also love history, and I've been a reader of crime fiction for ages now. I've read hundreds across cultures. Being a teacher in the university, I also had to teach a paper on crime fiction, so that sort of just intensified my love for the genre. How much was possible with it? That how dynamic this genre is, how well it travels, um, all that, and then the fact that it can be such a good crime can be such a good prism through which you can see a society, through which you can explore issues of society. I think it's P.D. James who puts it very well when she says about G.K. Chesterton. This is the teachery self in me coming out, quotes, that, he's the first one to find out that you can really explore and understand a society through a crime, through writing a crime novel. So I think that's something that struck me. And since I was researching crime in late 19th century Bengal, I thought it would be, just writing a novel would be a fascinatingly fun way of exploring that period more. Just to also answer that question, why that particular period? Two reasons. One, because that seemed to be a period when, the police detective is kind of coming in, the Indian Bengali police detective is coming into his own. They are being appointed, they are writing about their cases, etc. So that's one reason. The other is this whole Swadeshi movement that's happening. So the ideas of nationhood, what it is to be an Indian, what it is to be a Bengali, that's coming about. But at the same time, it's a very Hindu upper caste identity assertion that's happening. So it's alienating certain castes, it's alienating certain communities. It's also alienating women because on the one hand, these people, the Swadeshis, are talking about change. They're talking about rebellion. They're talking about questioning authority. But on the other hand, they don't want their women to have those rights. So when it comes to women, they kind of become more and more conservative. No, you have to exist in a certain way. You have to follow certain codes, certain rules, certain norms, because identity has to be, of a certain kind. So these contradictions, complexities, really, really interested me, fascinated me, and I thought I could, naive me, probably reach out to more readers, to more people through a crime novel rather than just a dry academic book. So that was.
So it's obviously sort of an interest in history coupled with your interest in crime fiction that sort of sparked these ideas. Now, Madhulika, your detective fiction is set in Mughal Delhi. I think it's the period of Aurangzeb's reign.
Just before Aurangzeb. So it's mostly 1656 and 57. So in 57, late 57, Shah Jahan fell ill, and that sort of sparked Aurangzeb's rebellion and his brothers and stuff like that. So
What was it
56,
about
57.
this particular, this little sort of period which was so exciting for you that you chose it as your setting?
For me, it was it was a no-brainer from the very beginning that it would have to be Delhi because I've lived in Delhi most of my life, so it's the city I'm most familiar with. So that was definitely, I knew it was going to be Delhi. Also, there was a very practical consideration of research. Which period would, if I had to set it in a historical period, the Mughal period is probably, the Mughal period and the colonial period are both, it's relatively easy to do research. So for instance, if I was trying to do Delhi Sultanate, I would have a much tougher time. But Mughal Delhi, there's a lot of research material freely available. So that was one reason. Now, Mughal Delhi actually, although Humayun, Babur, etc., did have brief fleeting periods in Delhi, there's really not that much. So Delhi actually came into its own as a Mughal city in the time of Shah Jahan, when Shah Jahan shifted the court from Agra and brought it to Delhi. And by 1656, all these major monuments had been built. The Red Fort was ready, the Jama Masjid was built. And it was an interesting period because at the same time, while all these extravagant building projects were happening, and Shah Jahan had commissioned the Peacock Throne and all that, you would have thought that the empire was really wealthy. But at the same time, they were suffering reverses everywhere. The Deccan kingdoms were up in arms, and it was actually there was a real dichotomy over there. So it's a very tense period. It's a very turbulent period. not just for the rest of the empire, but for Delhi. For Delhi. And of course, you know that, if you know your history even briefly, you know that Aurangzeb took advantage of Shah Jahan near the end and sort of exiled him to prison till the end of his days, right? So you know that Aurangzeb is waiting in the wings. So I thought that this was a very interesting period. And when a city is in so much turmoil, the chance of somebody taking advantage of it to actually commit murders of their own, not necessarily political, is I thought it was ripe for a crime novel.
I think the best thing at this point would be for you perhaps to
read?
read out a
Sure.
bit, just to give a flavor of the Delhi that you have recreated.
Okay. So here I'm talking about my main character, Muzaffar Jan, who is the detective, has gone to this place called Chowk Sadullah Khan, a heaving, busy mass of people, animals, and their concomitant smells, sounds, and colors. It was impossible to stand still here. The crowd surging around Muzaffar would not let him do so. It caught him up and swept him on, pulling and tugging. But some 20 yards into the mass of humanity, and he found himself pulled up short because a hand had reached out and gripped the corner of his choga. It was a Hakim, wearing a vivid blue choga and seated on a Persian carpet that had seen better days. His stock in trade lay spread all about him, pouches large and small, guarded by a skinny youth with a wart on his nose. Huzur, began the Hakim, his voice ingratiating. A fine young gentleman such as you. But I fear you will not require my services. The elixirs I offer, the ecstasies that can be yours. His grip on Muzaffar's choga had not slackened, and Muzaffar, from previous experience, knew what was coming. Offers of purified mercury and borax, a fine paste made from the best cow dung mixed with butter and the juice of the thorn apple. And who knew what else? A wool like product obtained from an insect called a jalshuk. Muzaffar had never in his life seen one, but he had heard it praised to the skies by the Hakim such as this. I have no need for aphrodisiacs, old man, Muzaffar said, and with a sharp tug pulled his choga free and went his way. Next to one of the fountains, he passed a small knot of people gathered around a dastan go, a storyteller who was in the middle of recounting the adventures of Amir Hamza. The Dastan-e-Amir Hamza had been derided by the Badshah's illustrious ancestor, the Shah Babar, but with little effect. This fantastic story of romances, pranks, magic, and adventure had become perhaps the most loved of all narratives in Delhi's streets. The Dastango was describing Amir Hamza's friend, Amar Ayyar now. His eyes were like cumin seeds in size and shape. His ears were like apricots, and his cheeks had the soft look of yeasty bread. This, by the way, is actually quoted from Dastan-e-Amir Hamza. He sounds more like a dinner than a man, shouted a wisecrack. And the Dastango's voice was drowned out in a wave of laughter. Thank you.
I think it's obvious that tremendous amount of research has gone into not just creating the setting for the reader, but also all the characters, the colorful characters that come in. And this, in fact, is what I felt while reading Crimson City, that the whole city and its people and that entire era comes alive for the reader. This is one of the good parts of reading Madhulika's book, that you are just transported to a different era. Now, coming to the research which is involved in these in this kind of work, for yourself and for Shampa as well, what are the kind of books that you read? Maybe Shampa could tell us something about that. To recreate that.
Research.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So for research, see, I am the kind of person who loves being in libraries. I can spend my life with libraries. So I have been to all kinds of archives in Bengal, which was quite something, and which seem to have stayed just the same since the 19th century, in fact, and Delhi also. But I discovered this particular writer called Priyanath Mukhopadhyay, who was a daroga late 19th century, and who serialized a whole lot of these Daroga accounts, which were actual cases that he had investigated and solved. And hardly anyone seems to know so much about him, because whenever we talk about early Bengali crime fiction, we say Filuda or Domkesh. But much before them, this man was writing these immensely popular case accounts. So as I started reading his cases, I also then ended up translating some of them. I was absolutely fascinated by that kind of investigative work that was happening. Not that I liked him as a man. I mean, he's quite awful. He's a misogynist, really. Very often, when he writes about women as victims of crimes of different kinds, either they've been brutalized by their families, or killed by their husbands, or exiled to Kashi, or he seems to suggest that, well, they deserved it. So there is no empathy or sympathy for the female victims, perpetrators, to chhod hi do, witnesses, nothing. So I kind of, it was like a shadow boxing going on. On the one hand, I needed him for my research, but at the same time, I kept thinking that, here are all these various stories about women that he seems to have in his cases, which he's never explored, which he's never really bothered to sympathize with. Maybe one could retrieve some of those and use them to write them differently and explore these stories, these voices, these perspectives in a way that he never dreamt of. So he was one font of material for me from that period. Mm, Plus, of course, crime fiction also got written around that time. So those also I read. A lot of Bangla crime fiction, which were again demonizing women. A lot of them really, really demonized any kind of woman who transgressed in any way, adulterous relationship, or the kind that we know as badass nowadays. So any kind of badassness was not to be tolerated. So they were seen as awful words are used for them: Kal Nagini, Sarpini, and so,
Terrible,
serpents.
yeah.
So there is this wealth of material that's there, and which could then be used and kind of reworked in a novel that I thought I was writing. So that became my research. And of course, one had read historical crime fiction. I mean, my absolute favorite is Margaret Atwood's Alias Grace, which is not, in that sense, can't be categorized as crime. But it's such a wonderful, wonderful novel about this maid who is a killer. And then she goes into this whole thing of whether she was evil or not. And you never, even by the end of the book, you don't figure out, how to conclude what to say about Grace, whether she was evil, whether she was good intentioned. She remains an enigma. So, so historical crime fiction, but I think for me, Priyanath Mukhopadhyay's work really became
You said he was a
he was a
daroga
daroga himself.
in somewhere in rural Bengal.
No, Kolkata. He was a Kolkata inspector. His work was serialized for over a decade. I think close to 2 decades, if I'm not mistaken. They were called Daroga Daftar.
Okay, it sounds almost like a carryover term from the Mughal. Yeah, and in your book too, you.
Because in any case, the Mughals, they had, Bengal was one of the biggest subas, right?
Okay.
So the Mughals were, and I think a lot of Persian influences in not just Bengali, but in the food and all also, right? Or came from through the Persian connect.
Oh, that's something new which I've learned. And Shampa, just the point that you made about women being, at the center of the crime fiction, and more often than not, probably being demonized, which means what kind of crime fiction was it that was being written at that time?
Oh, these are pretty much, a lot of them were mimicries of the Holmesian model. So,
okay.
So a lot of these were, again, centered around a male detective. But strangely, the male detective would come up against a female adversary. Yes.
Scandal in Bohemia.
And in fact, there is a criminal mastermind in the novels of, I mean, I don't know if you want to know these names. Pachkari De was a a very popular novelist of the early 20th century Bengal crime writing. And in his writings, there is this woman who is like a criminal mastermind. And the detective, there are 3 or 4 novels devoted to his trying to vanquish her and demolish her gang, etc.
Like a
So it's
female Moriarty.
like a female Moriarty, exactly. But you're never allowed to sympathize with her. You're never given a backstory. You're never really, allowed to hear her voice. Though you can, if you want to, read against the grain. But you can see that the narrator doesn't want you to. That the dominant narrative voice is one of heavy criticism against this woman who's not a good woman, who's not a good wife, doesn't want to get married, doesn't want to do any of the feminine things that one was expected to, that a Bengali Bhadra Mahila was expected to do or accomplish. So she's very smart. She's smart as a whip. But that also goes against her, that kind of intelligence. So these were things that I read. And if you ask me what was a startling thing for me to find during the research, 2 things really. One, that there was an actual female detective who would be used by these police station, by the thanas. So she was not formally employed, but these were again, I suppose, free-floating kind of young widows, perhaps, because they're not mentioned in a lot of the cases, but they are mentioned in a couple, enough for me to sort of sit up and feel surprised that who's this woman, and so they would say, call her, and she will help us then figure out the secrets of a certain
There's a
case.
term which you use for these.
May Goenda, so girl detective. That's
okay.
the word. That's the phrase that they use. So she's like a. She's obviously not somebody very high up in the pecking order at all. But she's there. She is like this liminal, marginalized figure lurking there, and that itself is fascinating for me. That who is she? Where does she come from? Can one sort of dig up more about her? I wasn't able to, but she's there. And the other startling thing for me was to see that despite there being so much heavy disciplining of these female figures, that, you can't wear this, you can't eat these things, you can't read these education is being denied to most of them, etc. And especially if you're a widow, then your life is pretty much over. There is so much of rebellion against that also that's going on. That's what these crime stories seem to bring out. Because the punishment often is for some sort of infraction that has been. So either they've had adulterous relationships, or they've eloped with someone, or trying to elope. There's this fascinating story where, Priyanath comes across this young girl who has eloped with a lover. And she has then been left by the wayside by that lover, who was clearly after whatever wealth she's wearing all her jewelry and was. So he has, robbed her of all that, and he's left her there. Now he thinks that he will, Daroga Priyanath now thinks that he will rescue this girl. But she doesn't really want to go back home. So, there's this curious kind of disconnect between him wanting to act the savior and her saying, but I don't want to return. So, whereas you would think that she would be a very grateful recipient of his rescue gestures, but that's not how it works out. And he, of course, is saying throughout that, horrible girl, and is she a prostitute, and what is this? And so there is that criticism constantly. But as I said, if you want, you can read this differently, as an act of female agency. And
So the discovery of the female detective was something which you sort of
Yeah,
came
yeah.
across serendipitously while doing
Absolutely,
your
yeah,
research.
yeah.
You've got a character like that in your novel, a girl called Bama. Yeah.
In fact, that's the name of the female, the Mago in the source material as
Oh,
well.
would you read out maybe a little passage just to give us a sense of what Bama is all about?
So this is where the detective, Dhananjay Lahiri, is kind of at the end of his tether. He doesn't know how to move ahead in his case. And his sidekick, who's not usually very bright and or enterprising, suddenly comes up with this idea of the female detective because he's heard of it. So I'll just read these paragraphs. The two policemen sat for a while in despondent silence, watching the smoke of their cigarettes curl upwards in a spiral. Dhananjay took off his spectacles to rub the bridge of his nose and put them back again. And just then, Bansidhar felt his spine tingle with excitement. He gaped at joy as suddenly, from some deep recess of his mind, an idea came thundering. Brimming with excitement, he grabbed Dhananjay's arm and shouted, Joy, I have thought of something. We can get a May Goinda, a girl detective, to find out a few things for us from the Rajbari women. The Rajbari is where the crime has happened. Then he elaborated on what he meant when he saw the flummoxed expression on Dhananjay's face. It was Daroga Shamacharan who had explained this strange phenomenon of a girl detective to Bansi yesterday. And then there is this little flashback of how that explanation happened, etc. But anyway, I'll just skip that. And then he says, What do you think, Dhananjay? Didn't you say Kamini is looking for a new assistant in the kitchen? If we can get Bama and train her for a day or two, she can be the kitchen hand that Kamini is looking for. And while she's working there, not only can she talk to Puti, she can also be our eyes and ears. She can report to us anything that might help our case. Dhananjay was staring at his friend as though Bansi had just offered a pot full of Amrit to him. That's a brilliant idea, Bansi. A stroke of genius, absolute genius. He clapped his friend's shoulders energetically. Bansi finally understood what it meant to be over the moon, etc. I'll just skip to the part where Bama walks into the house. The very next day, a letter was sent to Shamacharan. Dhananjay had urged Bansi to tell his friend that there was no time to lose. Bama, the May Goinda, that weird thing that Bansi had talked about, came to their house the following evening. Dhananjay was taken aback when he saw her. But then he reproached himself for feeling surprised. What was he expecting? He wasn't quite sure. The very notion of a May Goinda, in fact, had boggled his mind. He had tried imagining what she might look like and failed. And then when he saw Bama, he was struck by the fact that he would have walked past the thin, bright eyed girl on the road without ever being able to guess that she worked as a Goinda, as a detective, that is. But that was a good thing, wasn't it? He chided himself. It meant she could blend in wherever she needed to. As they explained everything to her, the young woman tilted her chin and listened to them with the utmost attention. Finally, she nodded. Theek ache, Bansidhar Babu. I'll go there tomorrow and tell Kamini I've heard she's been looking for someone to help her in the kitchen.
That was nice. Thank you, Shampa. Both of you have created characters, detective characters, that are not at all molded along the Holmesian lines or the lines of any Western detective. These detective characters are completely rooted in the Indian milieu, though the milieus are very different. One is Mughal India and the other one is colonial Bengal. And all the characters that surround these detectives are also very different, which is what makes the both books, I felt, a very enriching read. You learn so much without realizing that you're actually learning. So coming to characterization, because that's actually very important when it comes to crime fiction. how did you come up with detective characters that you have created? Muzaffar Jung, who's a nobleman, but he has access to all parts of society, and Inspector Dhananjay Lahiri, who is actually a rural boy who becomes a police inspector in the Calcutta police service. So maybe you
Want to go first? Okay. Okay, so Muzaffar Jung is actually, though he's a nobleman, he's a maverick. He's an outright maverick. And, you know, Mughal India was, Mughal Delhi was not a place where, which was, as you can imagine, it was not, it was a society which was riddled with uh, schisms. So you had different classes, you had different castes, you had different communities, of course, and not just that. What a lot of people don't realize is that Mughal Delhi was a hugely cosmopolitan place as well. So you had, there was this man called, I forgot what his name was. I think it was his name was Suraj Bhan Bhandari or something like that. He was a chronicler of the historical period, the Mughal period, and he has actually written. There's this whole section where he talks about the different countries from where people used to come to live in Delhi. And he talks about people coming from Mahacheen, which is China, Cathay, and Egypt, and Persia, Abyssinia. In fact, the Kotwals of Delhi, there was a long tradition of having Abyssinian Kotwals. I mean, who would have thought, right? You don't think of, you know that Persians were there in Delhi, but you don't realize that there were Kotwals were often Abyssinians. Then, so there were people from all across the world in Delhi at that time. It was your melting pot. So it was a very fractured society also, because obviously people from, uh, we are not, I think most Indians are not the most open minded of people. So I would think that at that time, with so many different communities, so many different nationalities, religions, castes, etc., it would have been a very tense place. And you would stick to your own kind, right? You would stick to your own community, your own, if you were a Hindu or something, you stick to your own caste and whatever. But Muzaffar, I think of as a man who is more broad-minded. So he's happy being friends with whoever comes his way. So in fact, in Crimson City, one person he makes really good friends with is a man who's he's a he's a sort of a clerk to a cloth merchant. And similarly, Muzaffar has a very good friend who's a boatman on the Yamuna. So Muzaffar is this. He gets about. He makes friends with the oddest of people, and interestingly, he does not think of his wife as being just a pretty little thing to be kept at home. So he has a lot of respect for her intelligence. And when Shireen is Muzaffar's wife, when she tries to help him in his work, he actually welcomes that help, and he actually asks for her help as well. So he asks for her advice, and he takes that advice as well. So I think in many ways Muzaffar is actually me. He's actually me, but in a different period. So he thinks the way I think. So he is not really a 17th century Mughal man. He is actually 21st century me. So, yeah.
That's interesting. Are you on the same page with your detective Dhananjay?
Yes, I because again, I think Dhananjay Lahiri was supposed to be the alter ego to Priyanath. So, somebody who was not at all going to be like him, but also not at all like Holmes. So that also
He doesn't like Holmes.
he does
though.
not like Holmes also. In fact, as I read, that's something that I learned as I read Priyanath's work also, that detection work is nothing like what it is made out to be in these, Western models that a lot of Bengali readers were reading also. Uh, so it was a lot of legwork. It was also a lot of going to very difficult places, Priyanath loves to moan about that, I don't have a choice. My boss has been haranguing me, and he's a British boss. What can I say? So even if it's Durga Puja, I have to go. So he's quite a moaner also. But he does end up going to, different kinds of places within Bengal, but difficult rural places, meeting all kinds of idiosyncratic individuals, a lot of whom will clam up when they realize it's a policeman who will not want to talk. Equally, there are places where he'll meet people who are very eager to talk. So that's what constitutes detection for him. He's not an amateur detective. He's a policeman. So there's a difference, and that's what I also wanted to come through in the Dhananjay Lahiri kind of detection. That it's also physically hard work. It's a lot of walking. It's a lot of meeting people. It's not sudden sparks of inspiration that are happening. It's careful, patient piecing together of things that go on, and there is no forensic science to help them. So it's also reading of body language, listening to accounts by people, etc. So those are the things that kind of inspired me. But yes, it is a modern sensibility in the sense that he definitely does not have Priyanath's patriarchal attitudes at all. Misogyny, in fact, I would
No,
say.
he is. I sort of liked him because I felt that there was something about him which you kept away from the reader. He doesn't come
Yeah.
out fully
That's
in
true.
front of the reader,
That's true.
which is interesting. Plus,
Also, probably because I wanted the other characters to come across.
Yeah.
not
So
so
he
much
has that element of mystery. Both your characters are enigmatic in their own way, which I think makes for a very good detective. You're the reader is kind of engaged with that too. Now, when it comes to you've written Madhulika. Your book has a lot about the multiculturalism of Delhi at that time, the different castes and communities and the social tensions that were there. Also, you have in Crimson City, that was what engaged me a lot, that you described the Hindu and the Muslim relationships, which and how they were. And how now that that period of history is such a contested topic, how do you approach your responsibility as a writer, and as a and how accurate are you when it comes to depicting the reality, and then also bringing in your imagination?
I feel very strongly that a lot of people have the wrong impression about history. So, for instance, on the one hand, you talk about Aurangzeb being a bigot, which he was, which he definitely was, and he did a lot of really horrible things. But you also need to remember that a lot of that was political. The problem was not that he sort of destroyed Hindu temples and all because of the religious aspect, but say it was a lot of it was politically motivated. So, for instance, not many people realize that of all the emperors, of all the Mughal emperors, Aurangzeb was the one who had the largest number of Hindu mansabdars. You always think of Akbar as being the most tolerant
Yeah,
and the most broad-minded and all that. But Aurangzeb was the one who had the largest number of Hindu mansabdars, which is there's something
Yeah, it is-
odd
there's something
there,
odd,
right?
yeah,
There's something odd about that. And also, if you go back in time, so for instance, setting aside the Muzaffar Jung series, I am writing this series called the Delhi Quartet, which is historical fiction. It's not crime fiction, but it's historical fiction, and there's a set of novels which are set against a backdrop of 800 years of Delhi's history. So for that I researched early Mughal history as well, and the sort of things you come across. So, for instance, I don't know how many of you have heard of Hemu. Hemu was this man who was briefly, for about a month or so, he was officially the king of Delhi. Right? He crowned himself Raja Hemchandra something. And there was this whole thing about that, we will have Ramraj and all that. But Hemu came to the throne on the backs of he had a huge his best generals were all Afghans. So, you have to keep in mind that thing, that what we think of kings and religion as being a sort of in Hindi it's called a lakir. So it's not engraved in stone. It is not etched in stone. And loyalties went across based on politics, not so much on religion. So I try to talk about that. I try and show that, it's not so much about religion. There is that, Muzaffar realizes that yes, there is a religious boundary. So when, for instance, he goes to somebody's house, this man is a Hindu, and Muzaffar goes to his house to investigate the kidnapping of this man's little son. And, Muzaffar briefly wonders if he's going to be given something to eat or drink. Then he remembers that, okay, this is a Hindu household. I will not be given anything to eat, or that sort of thing. That you realize that it is there. You are not offended by it. You don't say that, okay, this is a personal attack on me. This is just how these people are. And you accept it. As long as it is not hatred, you respect the difference.
Yeah, I think that is what came through when I read that particular passage that you're describing. It struck me that, yes, there seemed to be a lot of respect for the differences, which probably allowed them to coexist. And so that was very interesting. Shampa, when we come to Bengal, you have very, very poignantly described the plight of widows. And that, in fact, seems to be like a running strand through the book. And you talk about, the moral policing and the isolation, but also with all that, how they are sort of exploited in all kinds of ways. So when you looked at this particular aspect during your research and your writing, what did you understand about gender and power politics at that time, and how far have we come since then?
I think, again, as I was saying, yes, they were victims. Yes, they were exploited. Yes, they were expected to follow absolutely untenable kind of rules regarding lives, regarding food, regarding mobility, clothing, etc. But at the same time, what was surprising for me was how much they also pushed back. So many of them did. So any kind of sexual expression, of course, was totally, out of the question. What I've also tried to do is look at a widow of a certain class. So she's not also an upper class widow. She's a widow who is working as a cook in the Rajbari household. So, which means that even though she's upper caste, she's oppressed in terms of class. So does she even deserve a full-fledged investigation? Does her death or murder even deserve that kind of investigation or attention? That's a question that Bansi, for instance, brings up, and Dhananjay says that everybody does. So this whole idea of equality also that I've tried to, and she's not just upper caste, she's also upper caste of a certain kind, in the sense she's Kulin Brahmin, where the women were expected to marry a Brahmin of a certain subsect. So, which meant that very old Brahmins could marry extremely young girls, because there weren't that many, men, Kulin Brahmin men, which was absolutely horrifying, which was absolutely shocking. But parents forced girls to do that. And once those much older men obviously died, and they could marry multiple women, because there weren't that many Kulin Brahmin men. So, and once they died, these very young girls had to follow this life. They had to wear white. They couldn't eat fish. which is a huge thing for Wongs. And they had to fast on several days. They couldn't go anywhere. And of course, chastity for the rest of the celibacy for the rest of their lives. So, and I remember there's this very poignant, that's the word that you used, line in Chokhir Bali, in Tagore's Chokhir Bali. I think it's in Rituparna Ghosh's film, and perhaps not in the novel, where someone says to Aishwarya Rai's character, she's a widow, she's a very young widow, that Jagdish Chandra Bose has found out that plants are sentient beings. And she says, she's this young widow, and she says that how strange that the Bengali intelligentsia should see plants and be able to see life in them. Whereas there are these half-dead women, so many of them leading these death in life kind of lives, and they've never noticed. They've never bothered with us. So, it's really, really very tragic as you read. And the kind of crimes that get committed. Some of them also end up committing crimes also, certain kinds, they elope or whatever. I won't go into all those details. But yes, I would expect that crimes of that kind would resonate with us as well, because we still have honor killings. We still have, let alone harassment and all that. And I live in Delhi. So, it's synonymous with crimes against women. But this tussle between modernity, on the one hand, we talk about autonomy for women, we talk about rights for women, but on the other, this refusal to grant them agency, the refusal to hear their voices, to learn anything from their perspectives. That's something which is an ongoing thing. So I don't see gender studies ever kind of becoming, anachronistic. So.
Thank you. We are short of time now. We've reached the end of our discussion, and now we are open to any questions from the audience. I'm sure there are, I can see raised hands.
Oh, okay. I know there's somebody with the mic at the back. Can't hear you. Could you just...
Yeah, because it's an all-woman panel, I feel privileged to ask this question. There's this book I read called Rooms of One's Own. It's written by Virginia Woolf. I'm sure you would know about it. It talks about how, as a female writer, there's a lot of disruptions, especially when we write. Like household responsibilities, or if you're doing a job with that and everything. So how was it writing the book? Did you have a lot of disruptions? Yeah, something on those lines. My question is for both the authors.
I actually, at the time when I wrote Crimson City, I did not have those many disruptions. But you know what? I think my first book was published in 2009. So I've been writing for a long time now. And I think I've got used to thinking of housework as just a part of life. I don't think of it as a disruption anymore, because I know that I'm doing that while at the time I'm writing as well. So unless there's a third thing coming into the equation, I don't even think about it anymore. So I have begun to plan my writing, taking into consideration that disruption is always going to be there. So yeah, I think it's something which has come through experience. That's it.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up Virginia Woolf, one of my absolutely favorite writers. Yes, she talks about the importance of a room of one's own, and women are, I don't think women can ever afford to have that completely interruption-free sort of existence. But I think women are also born multitaskers. So I think that helps a lot. And that term perhaps never existed in Woolf's time. I don't know what she was complaining about, though. If you go, I've been to her to the house where she, sat and wrote, and she had this fantastic writer's room, and I doubt anybody ever disturbed her. So, and a beautiful library full of books. But I think women, as Madhulika also said, it's ingrained in us. I think we learn to adapt to any kind of situation, and we don't wait for that, special privileged moment when everything will sort of fall silent and we will be able to write. So we write as we go along with various disruptions and disturbances. So.
Good afternoon, ma'am. This is to Madhulika. See, during your conversation, you said Aurangzeb, even though he committed a lot of atrocities, it was from a political viewpoint. And subsequently, the other person, Hemachandra, he wanted to create a Ramarajya, so he employed a lot of Afghan rulers for whatever ends, Does it make it legitimate?
No, it does not make.
Because see, when this Navkali happened, Gandhi said, we'll stop the, agitation. He said, I don't want to do these kind of things. So he was more bothered about the means rather than the end. But in this case, does it justify?
I don't think it justifies. Nothing can justify violence. That is my belief, that nothing can justify violence. So the point I was trying to make was not that. I was not trying to say that it is justified. All I'm saying is that you have to take it. You cannot look at sort of history through such a narrow lens. You have to take into consideration other points of view. And the sad part is that we've started sort of trying to learn history through bite-sized nuggets, which do not bring in the nuances. And I'm not even saying that you go to my book to learn the nuances. I'm not a historian. I have never made it. I've never tried to claim that I'm a historian. I'm not. But you should definitely try and understand the nuances which might have been there. Go to a proper historian, to people who actually know the period. And, as I said again, nothing can justify violence. Absolutely nothing.
There's a question here. I think that will be the last one.
Hello, it was a pleasure listening to both of you. I have a very prosaic and boring question. The boring question is, every detective writer's aim is crime writer's aim is to make sure that the reader stays with them till the end, and then you serve up the twist or whatever it is in the last page. Now, given that at that time you don't have access to a lot of shorthand or telegraph, as you may say, such as forensic evidence, DNA testing, all the cool stuff that we have now, how do you structure your plots in a way that it unravels itself like an onion, a layer after a layer comes out? Because otherwise, no matter, ma'am, with due respect, how much nuance or cuteness there is, all of us who read crime fiction, we want to know who did it. So how do you keep us guessing till the end is my question. How do you structure your plots, in short?
That's a huge question. Yeah. I think it's Patricia Highsmith who wrote that talented Mr. Ripley, who says that a good piece of writing writes itself. No, that does not happen. It's a lot of hard work, But yes, your point is well taken, which is that at that time there was no forensic science. There's no DNA testing is a game changer. None of those things are there. But I think what was there, or what I could put into my novel, was a study of people. So that's the looking at body language, for instance. Taking cues from the way a person is speaking, the way they will not make eye contact, or they will make too much eye contact. So these are things that Dhananjay Lahiri is supposed to be good at picking up. And so that's what makes him a good detective. And in fact, that's what he thinks also sets him apart from, say, a police detective like Reid, R-E-I-D, who was a big name at that time and who had written about policing in contemporary Kolkata, and who had said that evil will always look a certain way. And Dhananjay says that that's not the case. That evil can come in all shapes and sizes and forms. So, so that kind of openness to these ideas about crime, about criminality, human psychology, interest in human behavior, etc., that's what sets him apart. And that's what makes it more interesting, because I personally am not interested in a Kathy Reichs kind of a novel, which is all about forensics and opening up of the body and all that. So this worked well for me, even though, as you said, there is no science in that sense.
I actually think that too much of the forensics business gets a little dry. I find it a little dry. But on the other hand, a detective who is actually a keen observer of not just human nature, but who's actually observant enough to be able to find clues where your average unobservant onlooker may not find. I think that is an interesting detective. But one way of keeping the interest going is to have little twists thrown in now and then. So you just when you feel that, okay, this person sounds like the most likely suspect, you realize that, oops, this person got murdered. Or something like that. So I think that is one way of keeping the interest going, and of having clues emerge slowly now and then in different ways, not necessarily just through interrogations. So there are different ways of doing it, but I think that requires a good long session of its own.
I think we are done now. Thank you for being a great audience. And thank you both.
She said you can use the mic.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry. I was speaking into space. Thank you for being a very great audience. Thank you for the questions. And I thank my panelists for a very enlightening discussion.